It was the year 1800, deep in the shadowed lands of Southampton County, Virginia, when a child named Nat Turner was born into a world of chains. From the very moment of his birth, whispers spread among the enslaved people that this child was touched by something greater, something beyond human. His grandmother would say, "This boy is a prophet. Mark my words, his life will not be ordinary." In the suffocating silence of the slave cabins, while men and women were forced to toil, under the lash, Nat's presence felt different. His eyes carried an intensity that unsettled even his masters, as though he was watching things no one else could see. As Nat grew, it became clear he was no ordinary slave child. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried a weight beyond his years. The elders whispered that he remembered things he could never have known, details of past generations, as if he had lived before. By the time he could walk, Nat would recount visions and strange dreams. He would say he saw spirits moving in the skies and angels who spoke to him in a language not of this earth. His mother, hardened by years of bondage, wept at these revelations, fearing that God had placed a heavy destiny upon her son. For Nat, life was not just suffering, it was preparation. The plantation where he lived was brutal, like all others. Fields stretched endlessly under the burning sun, where enslaved men, women, and even children bent their backs until their bodies gave out. Overseers carried whips, their cracking sound echoing like thunder, tearing flesh and spirit alike. At night, broken souls huddled together in wooden shacks, praying for freedom that never came. For Nat, these nights were not filled with rest, but visions. Sometimes he would wake in terror, seeing blood dripping from the moon. Other times he would dream of white spirits fighting black spirits in a battle that shook the heavens. To him, these were not dreams, they were signs. Nat Turner was taught to read the Bible, a rare privilege for a slave. Most masters feared literacy, believing it would spark rebellion. But for Nat, the Bible was not just a book, it was revelation. He read stories of Moses leading his people out of Egypt, of prophets who heard God's voice, of battles fought against oppressors. Every word felt alive, as if written for him alone. He began preaching to other enslaved people, speaking with a fire that ignited their hearts. They called him the prophet, for his sermons were not ordinary. They were warnings, visions, and promises of judgment. He declared that slavery was an abomination before God, and that a day would come when the oppressors would face divine wrath. Still, Nat's gift was both a blessing and a curse. His visions frightened even those who believed in him. He once claimed to see drops of blood on corn, a sign that death was near. Another time, he declared that he had seen the sun darken and stars falling from the heavens. Some said he was chosen by God, others whispered he was cursed. But Nat himself never doubted. To him, every sign was a message. God was preparing him for something monumental. Years passed, and Nat's faith only deepened. He withdrew from the temptations of the world, refusing alcohol, women, or pleasures that distracted others. He lived in discipline, fasting and praying, waiting for the command he knew would come. And when it came, it was as terrifying as it was undeniable. One night, Nat saw a vision of the heavens opening and the voice of God commanding him to rise and smite the serpent. The serpent, he knew, was slavery itself. It was not just about his suffering or his people's suffering, it was about divine justice. In his mind, the rebellion was not his plan. It was God's plan, and he was merely the chosen instrument. But visions alone could not prepare him for the world of brutality he faced every day. He saw women torn from their children, sold like cattle in the marketplace. He saw men beaten until their skin was shredded and bones crushed, simply for pausing in the fields. He saw children grow up only to inherit the same chains. Each act of cruelty carved itself into his soul, burning like fire. until his visions and his reality fused together into one undeniable truth. This could not continue, not forever, not in God's world. As a preacher, Nat learned the art of words. He spoke softly, then powerfully, pulling his listeners into his visions, convincing them that their suffering was not eternal. He told them of Egypt and Pharaoh, of plagues and deliverance, of God's wrath against the wicked. To the enslaved, his words were hope. To the masters, if they had heard, his words would have been terror. But they never listened, never understood. The storm building in the shadows of their own plantations. There was one moment Nat would never forget. During an eclipse, the sky darkened in the middle of the day. To many it was just nature, but to Nat it was confirmation. He raised his hands to the heavens and declared before the enslaved people, "The time is near. God has shown me his sign. We must prepare." His voice carried a conviction that silenced even the most doubtful. For them, Nat Turner was no longer just a man. He was a vessel of God's wrath, a prophet of blood and freedom. But Nat also knew the weight of what he was about to bring. Blood would spill, not just of the oppressors, but of his own people. Violence would summon violence, and the cost would be terrible. Yet he believed it was necessary. Just as Moses led his people through blood and fire to freedom, so too must his people endure the storm. To Nat, there was no other way. Freedom would not be given, it had to be taken, and God himself had commanded it. As the sun set over the fields of Southampton, the enslaved bent their backs under the lash, unaware of the inferno that was about to erupt. The masters drank their wine, oblivious to the judgment creeping closer, with every heartbeat. And Nat Turner, the quiet preacher, the prophet of visions, waited. His eyes, burning with faith and fury, gazed into the horizon. He knew the time of prophecy was ending, and the time of action was about to begin. The world did not yet know his name, but soon it would. The sun rose mercilessly over Southampton County, spreading its heat across the endless rows of cotton fields. For the enslaved, every day was the same, an endless cycle of back-breaking labor, hunger, and fear. Their hands bled from the thorns, their backs carried the weight of the overseer's whip, and their souls bore the crushing knowledge that freedom was a dream meant only for others. Nat Turner walked among them, not as a free man, but as one of the chained. Yet inside him burned something no master could ever shackle: conviction, vision, destiny. He watched the children stumble in the fields, their tiny hands forced to pluck cotton long before their bodies were ready. He watched mothers, still aching from childbirth, forced to labor under the sun with no rest, their babies left crying in cabins. He saw men beaten until they could not stand, then forced to crawl back into the rows to finish the day's work. The overseers laughed, their voices sharp and cruel, their whips cracking like thunder. Nat did not laugh. He prayed, and every prayer was sharper than a blade. He prayed for deliverance. He prayed for vengeance. At night, in the slave cabins, the air was thick with despair. The smell of sweat and dirt filled the small wooden shacks, where entire families were crammed together, lying on the hard floor. Some whispered stories of Africa, faint memories passed down through generations, a homeland most had never seen but still dreamed of. Others sang sorrowful spirituals, songs that carried hidden meanings, songs of rivers, of crossing over, of freedom waiting on the other side. Nat listened. He absorbed their pain, their hope, their fear. And when it was his turn to speak, he did not sing. He preached. His voice, low and steady at first, grew into something that filled the cabin like fire. He spoke of a God who saw their suffering, a God who had heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt. He told them their bondage was not eternal, that one day the mighty would fall and the oppressed would rise. The people listened with wide eyes, trembling, as though every word might be the spark to light a fire in their hearts. For Nat, this was not mere comfort, this was preparation. The masters, in their grand houses, believed religion made slaves docile. They thought sermons about obedience and patience would keep them quiet. But Nat's sermons were not like those. His words were weapons, sharper than the overseer's whip. He told his people to be ready, for God had promised justice, and justice would come like a flood. Every time Nat opened his mouth, he planted seeds, seeds of resistance, seeds of rebellion. Yet even prophets carried doubts. In the stillness of the night, Nat would sometimes wonder, was he truly chosen? Could a single man, no matter how filled with visions, change the fate of a nation? But when he closed his eyes, the visions always returned. He saw the sky drenched in blood, the ground shaking with the cries of the dead. He saw himself standing in the midst of battle, a sword of fire in his hand. And then he knew this was not a choice. It was a command. Slavery had taken everything from him, his freedom, his dignity, his people's future. But it had also given him clarity. He had seen what unchecked cruelty could do. He had seen families ripped apart, husbands and wives sold to different masters, never to see each other again. He had seen children scream for their mothers as they were dragged away to be sold in markets like cattle. These memories were carved into his heart like scars. They could never be erased. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Nat watched as a young boy collapsed under the weight of the cotton sack. The overseer's whip cracked instantly, lashing the child across the back until his small frame shook with sobs. Something inside Nat burned hotter than ever before. He clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. That night, he prayed not for patience, but for strength. He prayed for the day when the whip would fall silent, when the cries of his people would be replaced by the cries of their oppressors. And still, Nat waited. He knew that timing was everything. A rebellion launched too soon would be crushed. A rebellion without God's blessing would fail. So he watched the skies. For signs, he studied the stars, the eclipses, the storms. To him, every movement in the heavens was a message. And then it came, the great eclipse of 1831. The day turned to night, the sun swallowed by shadow. To many it was frightening. To Nat, it was undeniable. The heavens themselves were calling him to rise. From that moment, his sermons changed. He no longer spoke only of patience or hope. He spoke of action. He told the enslaved that the time was near, that God had shown his sign, that the oppressors would soon face judgment. His followers, few at first, began to gather in secret. They whispered his words when no overseer was near, passing them from cabin to cabin. They prepared in silence, sharpening blades, waiting for the moment Nat would give the command. Nat Turner, once just another enslaved man in the fields, was becoming something else. To his people, he was the prophet who would lead them out of bondage. To his masters, though they did not yet know it, he was a storm brewing in silence, ready to strike with a fury no one could contain. The fields of Southampton were soaked with sweat and tears, but soon they would be soaked with blood. Nat Turner had seen it in his visions, and now with the eclipse blazing in his memory, he believed with all his heart that God's time had come. The enslaved bowed their heads under the weight of their chains, but in their hearts, a new fire was burning. And Nat, silent and watchful, carried that fire like a torch. The world thought him powerless, but soon the world would tremble at his name. The summer air in Southampton was heavy, thick with heat and the smell of sweat and earth. The days stretched endlessly, each one bleeding into the next, as enslaved men and women labored under the merciless sun. But for Nat Turner, time was no longer a blur. Time had become prophecy. Each sunrise, each shadow, each flicker of light in the night sky spoke to him. The visions were no longer rare, they were constant, and they pressed upon him with unbearable weight. He had always been different, always marked. As a child, he had dreamed of spirits and angels. As a man, he had learned to read the Bible and found in its pages the voice of God. But now, the visions no longer came in whispers. They thundered. They tore at him until his body trembled. He saw rivers running red with blood. He saw the heavens open and the stars fall. He saw black men and women rising from the fields with swords in their hands. And always at the center of it, he saw himself, chosen, burdened, unshakable. The eclipse had been the greatest sign. It was not the first he had seen, but it was the one that confirmed everything. When the sun darkened in the middle of the day and the world fell into shadow, Nat knew beyond doubt that God's command had been given. This was not madness. This was not imagination. This was destiny. And it was near. In the slave cabins, when the work was done and the overseers had retreated to their homes, Nat spoke quietly to those he trusted. His voice was low, steady, but it carried the weight of thunder. "The Lord has shown me the sign," he told them. "The time is coming when we must rise. We must be his instrument. We must be the sword of his judgment." His followers listened with wide eyes, some nodding with fierce conviction, others trembling with fear. Rebellion was not just dangerous, it was suicide. But to them, Nat was not just a man, he was the prophet. And when a prophet spoke, they believed. Still, belief was not enough. To rise against their masters was to invite certain death. Every rebellion before had ended in blood. The rebels slaughtered, their families tortured, the survivors shackled tighter than before. Nat knew this history. He knew the risks. But he also knew the truth that burned inside him. God had chosen him, and if God was with them, no power on earth could stand against them. Each night as the others slept, Nat prayed. He prayed for strength. He prayed for clarity. And sometimes in the dead of night, he would leave the cabins and walk into the fields, staring up at the endless sky. There, he would see visions in the stars. Once, he saw a great white spirit and a black spirit locked in battle, the heavens shaking with their struggle. Another time he saw words written across the night, glowing in fire, "Slay my enemies with their own weapons." These visions did not terrify him, they steeled him, they told him what must be done, but visions alone would not win the war. Nat began to plan. Slowly, carefully, he gathered men he could trust. They met in secret, away from prying eyes, whispering their plans under the cover of darkness. Among them were men of faith, men who had suffered unspeakable cruelty, men who were willing to risk everything for freedom. Nat did not promise them safety. He did not promise them victory. He promised them justice, the justice of God, swift and merciless. The plan was simple, yet terrifying. They would strike at night, in silence, when their masters slept. They would begin with those closest to them, then spread across the countryside, killing every master, every overseer, every man, woman, and child who represented the system of slavery. To spare the innocent was to leave the serpent alive. To destroy slavery, the serpent had to be crushed completely. The weight of this command was unbearable. Nat knew that blood would flow, rivers of it, not just of their oppressors, but perhaps of their own. He knew the cost of rebellion would be high, but he also knew the cost of silence was far greater. Every day of slavery was its own rebellion of evil against God's creation. Every lash, every chain, every child sold was violence. Their rebellion would simply answer violence with violence. It would balance the scales. And so Nat prepared his followers not just with words, but with fire. He told them to sharpen their tools, to ready their blades. He taught them that fear was their enemy and faith was their weapon. He told them that the Bible itself had declared this war. Had not Moses led the Israelites through blood and plague? Had not David struck down Goliath with a single stone? Had not Christ himself promised that the meek would inherit the earth? The enslaved listened. Their hearts, long buried under chains of despair, began to beat with something new. Hope. Dangerous, fiery hope. Some trembled at the thought of killing. Others clenched their fists in readiness. All knew that once the first blow was struck, there would be no turning back. One night, as the air hung heavy and silent, Nat gathered his closest men. They sat in the shadows, their faces lit only by the faint glow of the moon. Nat's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of destiny. "The time has come," he said. "God has spoken, and we must obey. We will strike not as men, but as his soldiers. We will cut down the serpent and free his children. There will be blood, yes, but after the blood, there will be freedom. Do you believe this?" One by one, the men nodded. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their jaws, but all agreed they were bound now, not just by chains of slavery, but by the covenant of rebellion. They would rise together, or they would die together. As they parted that night, Nat Turner stood alone in the fields. The wind whispered through the rows of cotton, carrying with it the cries of centuries of bondage. He looked up at the sky once more, and for a moment he thought he saw the heavens burning, angels descending with swords of fire. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Your will be done." The serpent was about to be struck, and Nat Turner would be the hand that held the blade. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin and made every sound echo louder than it should. In the cabins of Southampton, weary bodies slept, their dreams chained as tightly as their hands had been during the day. But Nat Turner did not sleep. His eyes burned in the darkness, fixed on the visions that refused to leave him. The time was no longer near. It was here. And now he had to gather the men who would walk with him into the jaws of death. He began quietly, moving from cabin to cabin, choosing carefully. Not every man could be trusted. Not every man had the strength to keep such a secret. The rebellion would live or die by silence, and one loose tongue could destroy everything before it began. Nat chose those whose hearts he had already tested in his sermons. Men who had suffered deeply, men who had listened to his visions and felt the truth in them. They were men who believed not only in freedom, but in Nat himself. There was Hark, a tall man with a body hardened by years of labor, whose anger against the whip had never dulled. There was Henry, quiet and thoughtful, who had lost his wife to the auction block and carried the emptiness with him like a wound that would never heal. There was Nelson, sharp-eyed and fast, a man who had once tried to run and been caught, beaten nearly to death, and yet still held rebellion in his heart. And there was Sam, broad-shouldered and fierce, who had sworn he would never see his children live as slaves. These were not just men. They were soldiers in waiting for a commander to give the signal. And Nat Turner was that commander. In secret meetings under the cover of night, they gathered in the woods. The trees tall and ancient stood as silent witnesses to their covenant. They carried no lanterns, for even a flicker of light might betray them. Instead, the moon lit their faces, pale and grim. Nat spoke in whispers, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of destiny. "Brothers," he said, "the Lord has called us. His judgment is upon this land, and we are his sword. The time of waiting is over. Soon we will rise, and the oppressors will tremble." The men listened, their eyes fixed on him. Nat could see the mix of fear and determination in their faces. They knew what this meant. To rise up was to risk not just their own lives, but the lives of their families, their children, everyone they loved. But to remain silent was to accept chains forever. Hark was the first to speak. "I will follow you, Nat. I have carried this rage in my chest too long. If God has chosen you, then he has chosen me too." Henry nodded, his eyes wet with grief that had never healed. "They took everything from me, my wife, my children, my life. If this is God's will, then let it be done. I will stand with you." One by one, the others pledged themselves. Some did so with trembling voices, others with fire in their words, but all gave themselves to the cause. They were bound now, not by chains, but by oath. Nat Turner's heart swelled with a terrible mixture of pride and sorrow. He knew what he was asking of them. He knew many of them would not live to see another harvest, but he also knew this was bigger than life or death. This was prophecy. This was the hand of God moving through them. The plan was laid out in careful detail. They would begin with the house of Joseph Travis, Nat's master, striking swiftly and without mercy. From there, they would move from farm to farm, spreading terror, striking down every man, woman, and child who bore the mark of the oppressor. Nat had no illusions about the brutality of this plan, but in his eyes, mercy had no place in God's judgment. Mercy had been asked for and denied 1,000 times before. Now it was time for justice. They would gather weapons where they could, axes, hatchets, knives, and whatever firearms they might seize from their enemies. They had no cannons, no armies, no great stores of supplies. What they had was faith, fury, and the certainty that God himself was with them. Nat reminded them that David had faced Goliath with only a stone, and yet the giant had fallen. They would face giants too, and they would bring them down. As the days passed, the men prepared in silence. They sharpened blades in secret, hiding them under floorboards or burying them in the fields. They whispered oaths when no overseer was near, their voices trembling with anticipation. The women too, though not part of the rebellion, sensed what was coming. They prayed for their men, for their children, for the storm that was about to break. Fear hung in the air like smoke, but so did something else. Hope. Nat Turner knew the risk of betrayal. There had been rebellions before, and many had been crushed because someone spoke too soon. Someone broke under pressure. Someone sought favor from the masters in exchange for blood. But Nat trusted the men he had chosen. Their eyes carried the same fire as his. They would not betray him because they no longer lived for themselves. They lived for freedom. Still, Nat prepared for every possibility. He knew the rebellion might fail. He knew they might all die. But he also knew that even in failure, their blood would send a message that could not be silenced. Slavery thrived on fear, but if the oppressors learned to fear the enslaved, even for a moment, then the chains would never feel as secure again. On one of their final nights of gathering, as the men knelt in the woods, Nat led them in prayer. His voice shook the silence of the trees. "Lord," he cried, "you have seen our suffering, you have heard our cries. We are nothing but dust, but in your hand, dust can become a storm. Use us, Lord. Use us to bring down the proud, to shatter the chains, to strike the serpent. If we die, let our deaths be holy. If we live, let our lives be free. But whatever comes, let your will be done." The men bowed their heads, their faces wet with tears. When they rose, they were no longer slaves. They were soldiers of prophecy, bound to a mission larger than themselves. As Nat returned to his cabin that night, he looked out across the fields. The moonlight painted the cotton white, like a shroud stretched across the land. For generations, those fields had devoured the sweat, the blood, and the lives of his people. Soon, they would drink a different blood. Soon, the land itself would be baptized in fire. In the stillness of that night, Nat Turner understood the gravity of what was coming. He was not just planning a rebellion. He was unleashing a storm that would echo through history. He did not know if the world would remember him as a prophet or a monster. All he knew was that he could no longer remain silent. The serpent lived, and God had commanded him to strike. The gathering was complete. The men were ready, and the silence of Southampton would soon be shattered forever. The night of August 21st, 1831, settled over Southampton like a blanket of silence, heavy and suffocating. The air was thick, almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the slave cabins, families lay curled together, their bodies weary from the day's endless toil. The masters, secure in their grand houses, slept peacefully, never imagining that the shadows outside were alive with rebellion. For Nat Turner and his chosen few, the moment had come. No more waiting. No more visions left unanswered. God's command had ripened, and the first blow of judgment was about to fall. Nat moved quietly through the darkness, his face stern, his eyes burning with purpose. He had prayed, he had prepared, and now he was no longer simply Nat Turner. He was the instrument of God's wrath. Around him, the men he had gathered walked in silence, their hearts pounding. They carried axes, hatchets, and knives, crude weapons, but sharpened with deadly intent. They had no guns, no cannons, no armor. What they carried was something far more dangerous: faith and fury. Their first target was the home of Joseph Travis, the man who owned Nat. It was fitting that the storm should begin here, in the house that symbolized his own chains. The Travis household lay quiet, lit only by the faint glow of a dying fire within. Nat raised his hand, signaling the men to stop. For a moment, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the crickets in the fields and the beating of hearts. Nat closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. "Lord, guide my hand. Let this be your will." Then he stepped forward. The door creaked as they entered, the sound louder than thunder in the still night. Inside, the Travis family slept, unaware that death had already entered their home. Nat's men moved swiftly, their blades glinting in the faint light. The first blow fell hard and fast. Joseph Travis was struck before he even opened his eyes. His life ended in a heartbeat. His wife, startled awake by the commotion, let out a cry, but it was silenced almost instantly. Even the children, innocent though they were not spared. Nat's vision had made it clear. The serpent had to be crushed completely. Mercy would only allow it to rise again. The house was filled with the sounds of struggle, then silence. When it was done, the men stood breathing heavily, their blades wet with blood. Nat's face was cold, unreadable. He had known this would be brutal, but seeing it, the red on the floor, the lifeless bodies, was something else. Yet he did not falter. This was not murder. This was judgment. The men left the Travis home and melted back into the night, their numbers small but growing. With every step, their confidence hardened. They had struck the first blow, and now there was no turning back. Word spread quickly among those who had pledged themselves in secret. More men joined, slipping away from their cabins to take up arms. By dawn, their numbers would swell. But for now, they moved from farm to farm, their weapons flashing, their hands carrying out what Nat called the will of God. The next household fell just as swiftly, doors broken down, sleepers cut down before they could even rise from their beds. Fear spread like fire, carried in the screams that pierced the night before being silenced forever. The rebellion was no longer a secret. It was alive, and it was moving with the force of prophecy. As they moved, some hesitated. Some saw the faces of women and children and faltered, their hands trembling. But Nat's voice was there, steady and commanding. "This is the serpent. he told them. "Do not look upon them as flesh, but as chains. Every link must be broken." His words, fierce and certain, steeled them. They struck again and again, leaving behind only silence. The path of blood they carved through Southampton was not random. It was deliberate, a plan unfolding step by step. They struck at the families who held the most slaves, who held the most power. With each death, they sent a message, not just to the masters, but to the enslaved who watched from the shadows. Rise, rise now, or live forever in chains. By the time the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, the rebellion was in full motion. The quiet countryside, once so still, was now alive with the sound of vengeance. Shouts, cries, and the clash of weapons echoed across the fields. Men ran to join Nat, swelling his force. Women and children, though not fighting, prayed, in whispers, their voices trembling as they asked God to protect their men. The masters, still sluggish with sleep, at first could not comprehend what was happening. To them, the enslaved were not men, but property. The idea that these same men had risen against them was unthinkable. But as the news spread, farm after farm falling, families slaughtered, the truth became undeniable. Fear gripped them. Some fled into the woods, others locked themselves in their homes, clutching guns and praying the storm would pass them by. For Nat Turner, every step forward felt like prophecy fulfilled. He moved with grim certainty, his voice commanding, his presence unshakable. His followers looked to him not just as a leader, but as a prophet guiding them through holy war. Every vision he had ever seen was now unfolding before his eyes. The blood, the fire, the terror. It was no longer just a dream. It was reality, painted in red across the land, yet even in the midst of the violence, doubt flickered in some hearts. Some wondered if God truly demanded this much blood. Some feared the retaliation that was sure to come. But Nat silenced their doubts with his words. "The Lord has spoken," he reminded them. "This is not our doing, this is His. And if we perish in His name. But if we succeed, we will walk as free men under His Son." The men shouted in agreement, their fear drowned by fury. The rebellion pressed on. House after house fell. By the end of that first day, more than 50 white men, women, and children lay dead. Southampton, once quiet and orderly under the cruel system of slavery, was now chaos. Nat Turner stood among his men, the blood of judgment behind him, the promise of freedom ahead. He knew this was only the beginning. The serpent had been struck, but it was not yet slain. The days ahead would be harder, bloodier. The masters would not remain silent. They would gather, they would fight, and they would come with fire and steel. But for now, Nat allowed himself a moment to believe. For the first time in his life, he and his people were not bending under the lash. They were standing tall, armed, defiant. The rebellion had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sun rose over Southampton County with a crimson hue, as if the heavens themselves had been stained by the blood spilled during the night. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, unaware of the horrors that crept closer with every passing hour. The rebellion had already claimed dozens of lives, but now it was no longer a secret wave of violence sweeping through the shadows. It was a storm crashing openly across the countryside. Nat Turner, his axe still slick from the night's work, led his men forward with unshakable conviction. He did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as God's sword, cutting away the sin that had poisoned the land for generations. By dawn, their numbers had grown. What began as a small band of determined men had swelled as word spread from plantation to plantation. Slaves who had once bowed their heads in silence now stood with weapons in their hands, their eyes blazing with a freedom they had never dared to imagine. They carried axes, pitchforks, clubs, whatever tools they could find. Some even brought their wives and children to follow behind, not to fight, but to witness what they believed was the beginning of a new world. The first farm they struck at sunrise was the Whitehead plantation. The family slept peacefully, never dreaming that the very men who labored in their fields would return in the morning as executioners. The door was forced open with a crash, and within moments the household was filled with screams. Nat's followers moved swiftly, their blades cutting through sleep-fogged bodies. Blood ran across wooden floors, soaking into the boards as the cries were silenced one by one. To the rebels, it was not cruelty, it was justice long denied. Some hesitated, their hands trembling as they raised their weapons against women and children. But Nat's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Do not falter," he said. "For every whip upon our backs, for every child torn from its mother, for every man who has died in chains, strike, strike, and know you are doing the work of the Lord." His words hardened their hearts. They struck again until silence swallowed the house. From there, the rebels spread like fire through dry grass. Each plantation they approached fell quickly. The enslaved either rose up to join them or watched in stunned silence, torn between terror and awe. In every field the same scene played out, white families slaughtered, black men armed for the first time in their lives. By midday their numbers had grown to more than 60, a ragged but determined army. With every step, the fear spread. Riders fled into the countryside, carrying the news that Nat Turner's army was on the march. White families abandoned their homes, fleeing into the woods or barricading themselves inside churches and courthouses. Mothers clutched their children close, while men loaded muskets with shaking hands, their faces pale with dread. For the first time, they felt the fear that had long been a constant companion to the enslaved. The rebels pressed on, their path marked by smoke and blood. Some of the men shouted as they went, their voices filled with rage. Others sang hymns, their voices rising like a battle cry. To them, this was not just rebellion. It was holy war, the final judgment upon their oppressors. Nat walked at their head, silent but resolute, his eyes burning with the fire of prophecy. He believed the sun itself was watching, bearing witness to the righteousness of their cause. At the Parker plantation, resistance came. The white men there had heard the news and armed themselves. As the rebels advanced, musket fire cracked through the morning air. One of Nat's men fell, his chest torn open, his body twitching in the dirt. For a moment the others faltered, but Nat raised his voice above the gunfire. "Do not fear death," he cried, "for the Lord has promised us freedom, whether in this world or the next." With a roar, the rebels surged forward, their crude weapons crashing against muskets and bayonets. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, but the sheer fury of the slaves overwhelmed the defenders. The Parker family fell, their guns silenced, their blood joining the growing river that marked Nat's path. Each victory fed their courage. Each death felt like another chain broken. But with every step, the resistance grew stronger. The militia was gathering, called from nearby towns and counties. White men on horseback, armed with rifles and sabers, were already moving to contain the rebellion. Nat knew they would come, but he pressed on. To stop now would mean failure, and failure meant eternal chains. By late afternoon, the countryside was alive with chaos. Smoke rose from burning houses, blood stained the soil, and the cries of the dying echoed across the fields. The rebels moved like shadows, striking swiftly, then vanishing before organized resistance could arrive. Yet even in their triumph, a sense of unease began to spread among them. For every plantation they burned, there were 10 more untouched. For every white family they killed, the militia raised 20 more guns. Nat saw the fear in their eyes, and he spoke to them as a prophet. "Do not look upon the strength of the enemy," he told them. Look upon the strength of God. Did he not bring down Pharaoh? Did he not part the Red Sea? Today, he parts the chains from our necks. Stand firm, for he is with us. His words lifted them, gave them courage to march on, but the violence had grown uncontrollable. Some men, drunk on vengeance, killed without mercy, striking down even those who begged for their lives. Homes were looted, fires set without thought. Nat tried to hold them to his vision, to remind them this was not for vengeance but for freedom. Yet he knew the line between justice and revenge was blurring, drowned in the blood of the oppressors. As evening fell, the rebellion had carved a path of destruction across Southampton. Nearly 60 whites had been slain. For the enslaved, it was a moment they had never imagined, to see their masters fall, to walk with heads held high, armed and unbroken. Yet the horizon was darkening, not with night, but with the storm that was coming. The militia was closing in, and with them came the full weight of a society built on slavery. Nat Turner stood in a field as the sun dipped low. His men gathered around him. They were tired, bloodied, but their eyes still burned with fire. Behind them, smoke rose from the farms they had struck. Ahead, the unknown awaited. Battle, death, perhaps victory. Nat lifted his axe high into the fading light. "Brothers," he said, his voice steady, "this day we have shown the world that we are not beasts. We are men, and men will not live in chains. If we must die, let it be as men, standing tall before the Lord." A shout rose from the rebels, a cry that carried across the fields, raw and defiant. The rebellion was not finished. The serpent had been wounded but not destroyed. And though the night ahead promised blood and fire, they would face it together, armed not only with weapons, but with the unbreakable belief that for the first time in their lives, they were free. The night had fallen heavy over Southampton, but it was not the calm darkness of peace. It was the charged, restless dark before a storm breaks. Nat Turner's men had fought, bled and marched through the day, their weapons still stained, their spirits high with visions of freedom. Yet behind the fire in their eyes, there was something else, an unease creeping into their souls like a shadow they could not shake. They had killed, they had burned, but the serpent had not died. And now, from the distance came the sound of hoofbeats. The rebellion that began as whispers and visions was no longer hidden. It thundered across Virginia, and the white world had awakened. Word had spread faster than fire. From farm to farm, from town to town, riders carried the alarm. Families huddled together terrified while militias gathered in haste. Muskets were loaded, swords unsheathed, men mounted their horses with faces pale but resolved. This was not just a rebellion. To them, it was the nightmare they had feared for generations. Slaves rising in numbers, unchained and drenched in vengeance. Nat and his men pressed forward, striking another plantation, seizing food and weapons, adding more men to their ranks. By now, their numbers had swelled to nearly 70. Some were fierce and determined, ready to kill or die for freedom. Others were hesitant, their hands trembling as they gripped their crude weapons. A few whispered doubts under their breath, wondering if God truly demanded this river of blood. But when Nat lifted his voice, those doubts were silenced. He reminded them of their fathers who had died in chains, their mothers who had been whipped until their flesh tore, their children sold like cattle to strangers. "This is the price of freedom," he told them, "and freedom is worth every drop." But as they marched, the reality of the enemy became clear. From the woods came shots that cracked the silence like lightning. Muskets fired, smoke rising. From hidden positions, one rebel fell with a scream, his chest torn open. Another dropped to his knees, blood pouring from his throat. The men scattered, ducking behind trees, their axes and knives useless against the rifles that barked death from afar. The militia had come, and they came with powder and lead. Panic spread quickly among the younger men, those who had never seen battle. Some wanted to flee, to run back into the woods and hide. Nat raised his axe and called them back, his voice fierce, commanding. "Do not fear them. They are flesh, they are mortal. The Lord himself fights with us." His words carried strength, and some rallied, charging forward with cries that split the night. They crashed into the militia like a wave, their crude weapons clashing with bayonets and sabers. The fighting was savage, close and bloody. Men grappled, teeth bared, knives flashing in the moonlight. The air was thick with smoke, gunpowder, and the copper stench of blood. For a moment it seemed the rebels might push them back, their fury overwhelming the surprised militia. But then reinforcements came, more white men on horseback, more muskets firing in volleys. Each shot cut down another rebel, each charge scattered their lines further. Nat saw his men falling, their courage drowned in blood. He swung his axe, again and again, but even as he fought, he knew the tide was turning. The dream of fire and freedom was meeting the cold steel of reality. They pulled back, retreating into the woods, their numbers slashed nearly in half. Some ran and never returned, their fear greater than their faith. Others followed Nat, unwilling to abandon the prophet who had led them this far. They regrouped in the darkness, their faces hollow with exhaustion, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. They were still alive, but they could feel the noose tightening. The countryside was no longer theirs. Every road, every farm, every shadow might hold armed men waiting to strike. Nat stood before them, his chest heaving, his clothes stained with the blood of enemies and friends alike. He looked at the faces of the men who had trusted him, their faith, their desperation, and for a moment he felt the crushing weight of prophecy. Was this truly God's will? Was this the holy war he had envisioned, or had his visions betrayed him? Yet even in doubt, he would not falter. He lifted his voice, calm but resolute. "Brothers, do not let fear consume you. Have we not shaken the world? Have we not made the masters tremble in their beds? We are not defeated. We fight on. If we die as men, not beasts." The men murmured in agreement, though their voices lacked the thunder of before. They were weary, uncertain. But they followed him still, drawn by his conviction, bound by the hope that somehow, against all odds, freedom could be seized from the jaws of death. Through the night they moved, striking small farms, taking food and horses, their attacks swift but desperate. Each strike was met with fiercer resistance. The countryside was awake, armed, and hunting them. Torches lit the roads, militias scoured the woods, and dogs barked in the distance, their howls like an omen of doom. By dawn, the rebellion was bleeding. The men who had marched with fire in their eyes now stumbled with exhaustion. They had lost brothers, cousins, friends. The dream was slipping like sand through their fingers, no matter how tightly they tried to hold it. Yet Nat pressed on, driven by the visions that had haunted him since childhood. He could not turn back. He could not surrender. Even as the weight of death pressed upon them, he believed there was purpose in every drop of blood spilled. In the distance, the bells of churches rang, calling the white population to arms. Smoke rose from camps where militias gathered, hundreds strong. For every rebel with an axe, there were now 10 armed men waiting to crush them. The storm was closing, and Nat Turner's rebellion, once ablaze, was beginning to flicker. But even as defeat loomed, something powerful remained. The rebellion had already carved its mark into history. Fear had gripped the hearts of masters. For once, they had felt the terror they had inflicted for generations. And though Nat and his men stood bloodied, hunted and cornered, the truth could not be erased. The slaves had risen, and they had shown the world that chains could be broken, even if only for a fleeting moment in fire and blood. Nat stood in The shadows of the forest, his men gathered around him. He looked into their tired eyes, and in them he saw not defeat, but a flicker of something eternal. Courage, defiance, humanity. And he knew, no matter what happened next, they had already changed the course of history. The rebellion was broken. What had begun in fire and blood, with shouts of freedom rising into the night sky, now lay scattered like ashes across Southampton County. The militia had struck hard, and the dream of an army of the enslaved sweeping away their masters had collapsed under the weight of muskets, sabers, and sheer numbers. Nat Turner, once at the head of dozens, now moved in silence with only a handful of men. Each step through the dark woods felt heavier, each breath filled with smoke and fear. The land that had seemed alive with promise just days before was now a cage, and every shadow whispered of betrayal. The white militias had turned the countryside into a hunting ground. They rode through villages and fields, armed with rifles and bayonets, their torches cutting through the night. Dogs barked, trained to follow the scent of blood. Bells rang out from churches, calling more men to the chase. The cry went up in every direction: Nat Turner must be found. The fear that had once filled the masters had turned into rage, a fire that demanded vengeance. And vengeance they would have. The rebels who had survived were hunted like animals. Some were captured quickly, dragged from hiding places and executed without trial. Others were torn apart by mobs, their bodies left hanging from trees as a warning. The countryside, once so familiar, now seemed alive with danger. Every farm, every field, every face could spell death. Nat watched as men who had once stood proudly beside him were cut down or vanished into the night, their courage drowned by the terror of the noose. Still, Nat moved on. For weeks he wandered through the forests and swamps, slipping through the cracks of the world. He ate roots, berries, and whatever scraps he could find. Sometimes he crawled into hollowed logs, lying in the damp and darkness, while militias passed so close he could hear the dogs panting, their claws scraping at the ground. More than once he believed his visions had been false, that God had abandoned him to hunger and fear. But then, in the stillness, he would remember the eclipse, the stars, the whispers that had guided him since childhood. He told himself this too was part of the prophecy. He was meant to endure, to carry the story, even if he could not carry the victory. The people who lived in the county knew he was out there, hiding, watching. Fear kept them awake at night, wondering if he might strike again. The militia combed the land, but Nat was a shadow, slipping through their grasp. Weeks passed, and his survival became a legend whispered among the enslaved. To them, he was no longer just a man. He was a spirit of defiance, too powerful to be captured. But legends can be hunted too, and legends can bleed. In the end, it was not the militia's skill, but betrayal that brought him down. A man named Benjamin Phipps, a farmer, was walking through the woods when he noticed a patch of earth disturbed near a pile of brush. Suspicion drew him closer. Beneath the tangled vines and dirt, hidden like a trapped animal, was Nat Turner. His clothes were torn, his body gaunt from weeks of starvation, but his eyes still burned with that same unyielding fire. Phipps raised his weapon, calling for others, and within moments the most wanted man in Virginia was dragged from his hiding place. Nat did not beg. He did not plead. Even as they bound his hands and jeered at him, he stood tall, his head high, his silence more terrifying than any cry. To his captors, he was not a broken man. He was still the prophet, the preacher who had dared to raise his people in fire. And in that silence they felt something colder than rage, fear. For though they had captured his body, they could not chain the vision that had already been unleashed. As he was carried back toward Jerusalem, the county seat, word spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered to see the man whose name had become a curse on white lips and a prayer on black ones. Children were lifted onto shoulders to catch a glimpse. Women spat as he passed, and men shouted for his immediate death. But Nat did not flinch. He met their eyes with a calm that unnerved them, as though he knew something they did not, as though even in defeat, the prophecy lived on. The rebellion was over, the dream shattered, but Nat Turner's capture was not the end. It was the beginning of something darker, something that would outlive him. The masters believed they had crushed the serpent, but what they had done was plant its seed deeper into the soil of America itself. And Nat, silent and unbroken, was the face of that seed. That night, locked in a cell with iron chains biting into his wrists, Nat closed his eyes. The screams, the blood, the visions, all of it played again in his mind. He knew the end was near. Yet even as the walls closed in, he whispered a prayer into the darkness. Not for himself, but for those who would come after. He believed the rebellion had failed only in flesh, not in spirit. For as long as men remembered that once the enslaved had risen, had fought, and had made the mighty tremble, the serpent was never truly slain. The jail cell was cold, damp, and reeking of rot. Chains clinked softly whenever Nat Turner moved, their iron bite digging into his wrists and ankles. Yet he sat with the calm of a preacher before his pulpit, his back straight, his eyes steady, his silence louder than any sermon. For weeks, he had hidden like an animal in the woods, hunted by men with guns and dogs. Now he was caught, caged, and waiting. To the white men who had captured him, this was the end of the prophet. But to Nat, it was only another step in the prophecy he had followed all his life. The news of his capture had spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, eager to see the man whose name had become synonymous with terror. To the enslaved, his name was whispered in reverence, proof that resistance was possible. To the masters, his name was poison, a reminder of their deepest fear that the chains they trusted so much could one day be broken. The trial was set quickly. They did not want delay. Southampton demanded blood, demanded vengeance, and the court was eager to provide it. On November 5th, 1831, Nat Turner was led into the courtroom, his chains dragging across the floor. The room was packed, every bench filled with men and women who had lost neighbors, friends, or family in the rebellion. Their eyes burned with hatred, but Nat did not lower his head. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, each movement echoing through the silent chamber. Judge Jeremiah Cobb presided, his face stern, his words clipped. He looked down at Nat as though he were not a man, but a beast to be judged before slaughter. The charges were read aloud: conspiracy, insurrection, murder. Each word rang heavy, meant not only to condemn Nat, but to warn anyone who might dare to follow his path. The penalty was clear from the start: death. But the court wanted more than his body. They wanted his voice, his confession, his soul laid bare. Thomas Gray, a local lawyer, was tasked with recording Nat's words. He asked questions about the rebellion, about the visions, about the killings. Nat's answers were calm, deliberate, almost detached. He spoke of the signs he had seen in the heavens, of the voices of God that had guided him since childhood. He did not deny the killings. He did not plead for mercy. Instead, he explained them as obedience, God's command carried out through his hands. Was not Christ crucified? He asked. And are not we as men bound to carry out his will, even when the world condemns us? His words unsettled the courtroom. Some scoffed, others spat, but a silence hung heavy in the air. For all their hatred, they could not break his calm. He did not rant like a madman, nor tremble like a criminal. He spoke like a prophet, a preacher certain of his calling. The trial lasted only a day. The verdict was never in doubt. Guilty on all counts, the sentence, death by hanging. When the words were spoken, Nat did not flinch. He bowed his head slightly as if in prayer, then raised his eyes and looked across the courtroom. For a moment, it seemed as though the fire in those eyes might leap into the hearts of all who stared at him. Some looked away, unable to meet his gaze. In the days that followed, Nat remained in his cell, visited by guards and curious onlookers who wanted to see the man who had set Virginia ablaze. Some mocked him, jeering at his silence. Others pressed him for more confessions, desperate to understand how one enslaved preacher had nearly overturned their world. But Nat said little. He prayed, he waited, and he prepared. On November 11, 1831, the day of execution arrived. The air was sharp with the chill of early winter. Crowds gathered in Jerusalem, the town square packed with men, women, and children who had come to witness the death of the rebel prophet. The gallows stood tall, a crude wooden structure against the gray sky. Its rope swung gently in the wind, a serpent waiting to strike. Nat was led from his cell, his hands bound, his steps steady. He wore no fear upon his face, no desperation in his eyes. To those who watched, he seemed almost serene, as though walking not to his death, but to his destiny. The crowd jeered, shouted curses, spat as he passed. Yet some were silent, watching him with unease. There was power in his calm, power that chains and ropes could not strip away. As he climbed the steps of the gallows, the murmur of the crowd swelled into a roar. The sheriff read aloud his crimes once more, each word carried on the cold wind. Nat stood tall, listening, then lifted his voice one final time. "I am at peace with the Lord," he declared. "Do what you will. The truth will not die here today." His words cut through the noise, and for a moment silence fell. Even his enemies felt the weight of them. The hood was pulled over his head, the noose tightened around his neck. The crowd leaned forward, breath held. With a single command, the trapdoor dropped. Nat's body fell, the rope snapping tight, his legs jerking once, twice, before falling still. The prophet was dead. But death did not silence him. In the weeks that followed, his rebellion cast a shadow across the South. Masters tightened their grip, laws grew harsher, punishments more brutal. The fear of another uprising haunted every white household. They believed they had crushed the serpent, but in truth, they had only proven how fragile their world was. For the enslaved, Nat Turner became more than a man. He became a legend, a spirit of defiance that whispered in the dark corners of cabins and fields. His body was gone, but his vision lived on. In every lash of the whip, in every chain that clinked in the silence of the night, there was the memory of the preacher who had dared to rise, who had spilled blood in the name of freedom, who had walked calmly to the gallows with the fire of prophecy in his eyes. Nat Turner died that day, but the rebellion did not. It lived on, smoldering beneath the surface, waiting for another time, another leader, another fire to rise. And though the masters celebrated his death as victory, history would remember it differently. For Nat Turner had shown the enslaved that the serpent could be struck, that chains could be broken, and that even in death, freedom was worth the fight. The body of Nat Turner was gone, yet his shadow refused to fade. In the weeks following his execution, Southampton County trembled with an unease that would not leave. The soil still bore the stains of blood, the ashes of burned-out homes still smoldered in the memories of those who had seen them. But it was not only the destruction of the rebellion that haunted Virginia, it was the spirit behind it. Nat Turner's ghost seemed to walk among the living, whispering in the fields, stirring in the hearts of those still bound in chains. For the slave-holding South, Turner's rebellion was the nightmare they had always feared, suddenly made flesh. Overnight, laws hardened like iron. New restrictions were written to suffocate every flicker of hope among the enslaved. Teaching a slave to read became a crime punishable by death. Gathering in groups was forbidden. Preachers were silenced, their voices crushed before they could spark another fire. Patrols were doubled, punishments grew more brutal, and the noose became a tool of warning rather than justice. The masters believed they were securing their world, tightening their grip on order. But in truth, their fear betrayed them. They could not sleep without guns at their sides. They could not look into the eyes of those who worked their fields without wondering if rebellion was waiting just beneath the surface. Yet for the enslaved, Nat Turner's name became a secret hymn. Spoken in whispers at night, sung softly in work songs, his story traveled from plantation to plantation. To some, he was a prophet chosen by God. To others, he was proof that chains could be shattered, that the whip could be defied. His rebellion had been crushed, his body destroyed, but the fire he lit did not die. It smoldered in the souls of men and women who longed for freedom, waiting for another chance to rise. In the North, the story of Nat Turner traveled fast, carried in newspapers and pamphlets. Abolitionists seized upon it, pointing to the bloodshed as proof of the South's cruelty. They argued that slavery itself was the true crime, that Turner's violence was not born of madness, but of desperation, the natural result of chains and whips. His confessions, recorded by Thomas Gray, became a twisted mirror used by some to demonize him, and by others to humanize the rage of a people denied their humanity. The nation split further, lines of fire drawn across its conscience. But memory is a dangerous thing. For the white South, Turner's rebellion was remembered as horror, as a nightmare of black vengeance. His name became a warning, whispered to children and servants alike. Obey, or the terror of Nat Turner will return. In this way, they tried to strip him of his humanity, painting him as a monster, a murderer, a devil in the flesh. But memory cannot be controlled so easily. For every tale of horror told by the masters, there was another tale told in hushed tones among the enslaved, a tale of courage, of defiance, of a man who chose death over submission. The years passed, but the rebellion's shadow stretched long. In 1861, 30 years after Turner's death, the nation erupted into civil war. Once again, blood was spilled across American soil, this time on a scale far greater than Turner could have ever imagined. To some, it seemed as though his prophecy had lived on, that the land would drown in blood until the sin of slavery was purged. And when the war ended, when the chains were broken at last, many whispered that Nat Turner had not died in vain. His rebellion had been a spark, small and desperate, but part of a larger fire that would one day consume slavery itself. Still, the legacy of Nat Turner is not simple, nor easy to hold. Even today, he is remembered in conflicting ways: hero and villain, prophet and butcher, freedom fighter and fanatic. His rebellion remains the bloodiest slave uprising in American history, a story of both courage and terror. The image of enslaved men striking down women and children is one that chills the blood, and for some, it is a wound that never heals. But to others, his actions are seen as the inevitable eruption of centuries of pain, the desperate cry of a people pushed past all endurance. What cannot be denied is the power of his story. Nearly 2 centuries later, the name Nat Turner still carries weight. It is a name that unsettles, that provokes, that demands reflection. It forces America to confront the truths it would rather forget: that slavery was not accepted quietly, that the enslaved did not bow in silence, that even under the heaviest chains, men still dreamed of freedom and were willing to pay for it with blood. Imagine the nights after his death, when the fields lay silent, but the enslaved whispered his name around fires. telling his story to the children who had not seen it with their own eyes. Imagine the fear in the hearts of the masters, looking out over their plantations, wondering which of the men and women in their service secretly carried his fire. Imagine the weight of a nation realizing that the system it relied upon was not stable, not safe, but built upon a foundation of rage that could explode again at any moment. That was Nat Turner's true legacy. Not simply the rebellion itself, but the fear it planted in the hearts of the powerful, and the hope it planted in the hearts of the powerless. His death was meant to erase him, but it only etched his name deeper into history. His calm at the gallows, his words before execution, his refusal to beg or break, these became his immortality. Even now, when his story is told, it carries with it the same unease that it did in 1831. Was he a madman, driven by visions? Or was he a prophet, chosen by God to strike the serpent? Was he a murderer or a martyr? The truth may lie somewhere in the shadows between those words, but one thing is certain. Nat Turner changed the course of America. His rebellion forced a nation to look at itself, to see the blood that stained its soil, to hear the voices of those it had silenced. As the years rolled on, his story passed into legend, into books and songs, into sermons and speeches. For those who sought to end slavery, his name was a rallying cry. For those who sought to preserve it, his name was a warning. And for history itself, his name became a test, a mirror held up to the soul of a nation, demanding that it choose how to remember him. Nat Turner walked to his death with chains on his hands and a rope around his neck, but he did not walk defeated. His body swung from the gallows, but his spirit did not fall with it. It lived on in the whispers, in the songs, in the very air of a country that could never again deny the truth. That the enslaved would not remain silent forever. That even in the darkest night, someone would rise to strike back. The bloodiest slave rebellion in American history ended with the death of its leader. But the fire he lit has never gone out. It burns still in the memory of freedom, in the story of a man who believed he was chosen to change the world. Nat Turner is gone, but his legacy remains, a scar, a warning, and a beacon all at once. A name carved forever into the heart of America.